Vicki is author of 6 books and over 50 journal articles, and publications include Europe's Migration Crisis, Reclaiming Migration, Post-Humanitarian Border Politics between Mexico and the US, the Contested Politics of Mobility, and the Exclusionary Politics of Asylum. So it's really fantastic, Vicki, that you've accepted this invitation and a special occasion of the 10th anniversary. So welcome and thank you. Vicki's going to talk now on the topic of coloniality, frictions and epistemic injustice, data-driven humanitarianism in northeastern Nigeria and South Sudan. So over to you, Vicki.
Do you need me to mic up or anything, or is it okay? Thank you. Will I be all right without a mic? Can I check? Hello, everyone. You can hear me all right in the room, I presume. Can we just check? Can anyone put their thumbs up online if they can hear okay?
I hear you. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Let me just move that out of the way, I think. I don't want to chip over. So thank you so much. Thanks for being here today. Thanks for the kind introduction. And I was, followed MRG over recent years closely, and I think I was one of the people saying great things about MRG to you, Anessa, on the way here. So I really appreciate the sustained collective work that's happening in the group, and it's a real honour to give the annual lecture on this special anniversary of the group at Sheffield. So thanks for that invitation. So as per the introduction, the talk I'm giving today is entitled Coloniality, Frictions and Epistemic Injustice, Data-Driven Humanitarianism in Northeastern Nigeria and South Sudan. And it's based on research carried out as part of an AHRC funded project, which I was principal investigator on, which Magilla mentioned, data and displacement. So this is a project that ran 2020 to 2023. And I'd really like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the work of all the research team. So this was a collaboration with multidisciplinary scholars from Nigeria, South Sudan and the UK. So particularly our colleagues in Nigeria and South Sudan, as well as the work of Modesta Alozi, who was a research fellow on this project and supported a publication on which the talk's partly drawing. And the images on this slide, this shows some of the key outputs from the research team, the public reports that we created, a policy report, and then some visualizations that we created on the project with and for our research participants. So, let's make this a bit bigger so I can see. So I think it's just maybe helpful from the start to say that we were looking at data and data practices, but we weren't focusing on a specific form or types of data practices. We were really exploring the lived experiences of datafication from the perspective of those people that humanitarians call affected communities, in this case, for our research, people that are commonly referred to as internally displaced persons or IDPs. So that was the kind of overarching aim of the project. This focus was aiming on looking at data production and use from the perspective of those displaced communities where internal displacement has been a significant factor over recent years. So we were carrying out research in northeastern Nigeria, high levels of internal displacement here over the past 2 decades, with around 2 million internally displaced people. And South Sudan, which although South Sudan gained independence, of course, in July 2011, conflict then broke out in December of 2013, leading again to high levels of violence and displacement, with again around over 2 million internally displaced persons. So the context was situations of conflict and displacement, but in both of these contexts, the collection of large-scale data is well established. So regular needs assessments, a collection of baseline data, and then the provision of services and humanitarian assistance in both of these contexts through EID cards. So that sort of biometric process has been rolled out in both cases. So we looked at these two contexts in light of what operational but also ethical issues arise in the development of what we call data-driven humanitarianism. So I'm going to start just by very briefly summarising the methods, just so you know a little bit about, the research that I'm going to be drawing on today in the discussion. And in particular, we had mixed methods. We were quite a big research team, so we were using different methods, some data set analysis, we were doing visualization methods. You've seen some of that in the images, and then observations and interviews. So semi-structured interviews with a total of 182 interviewees, 34 of which were online interviews. All of these were qualitative, semi-structured interviews, 34 online with what we call humanitarian data experts, so people within the humanitarian sector specialising in data, sort of more on the global level. And then we did a series of 70 interviews in each of the two cases in Nigeria and South Sudan, and they were face-to-face interviews. We did 50 with displaced people in each context, and then 20 with stakeholders working in that area. So I'm going to be drawing on those interviews. We had I won't go into too much detail, but we had a purposive sampling strategy. We're trying to speak to a kind of diverse as possible range of people according to age, gender, etc., faith, and the time they've been at the camp. And then humanitarian stakeholders and practitioners from across a range of different organisations. Just to say that the images on the slides are all images from our fieldwork. I don't have images on every slide, but if you have questions about those, of course, feel free to ask. But yeah, they do come from our fieldwork. Okay, so we undertook all of these qualitative interviews. We then went through a process of, they were all transcribed, and then we went through a process of analysing those. So I think I'd like to start. So you're going to get quite a lot of qualitative data in this talk. I'm going to be really talking about this through the interview material. And I wanted to start then with this extract of an interview that our team carried out with a man living in a camp or camp-like situation for internally displaced people in Nigeria. I think this exchange exemplifies some key concerns around data-driven humanitarianism, as well as in terms of datafication of processes that pertain to migration more broadly. So let me just go through this. So the interviewer says, do you know who uses the information you provide and for what purpose? So we're asking questions about their experiences of provision of data to humanitarian organisations. And the guy says, I don't know. Do you know how the information is shared? I do not know. Who knows? I do not even know where it will stop. Have you been told what's happening to your data? They've never told us. Or how your data is used to make decisions about what assistance you qualify for? Honestly, we do not know. Are you able to access your data yourself? No, almost all the information I have given have not been useful to me. And do you know anything about your data rights? No. So I come back to this exchange often, but actually I could have probably cut and pasted out of our interviews many actually of these exchanges that are not dissimilar. But I often come back to this one because I think it really provides so many insights into the way that the disregard for so-called affected communities is really baked into data-driven humanitarianism, into these processes of humanitarian data production and use. So the man points to his lack of knowledge about how his data is used or shared, describing how he does not even know where the data will stop. And I think this lack of understanding of how data travels is not only problematic in the sense that it highlights the failure of humanitarians, of course, to inform people from whom they collect data about what will happen with it, but it also points to an issue of wider concern, right, that in the context of changing data modalities, and also the drive towards interoperable data systems, so that is the drive towards merging different data sets, being able to kind of share that data. Once that data is collected and shared, it's really difficult to know how it informs decision-making processes and, of course, impacts on the lives of those people who have shared their data. So, function creep is another way of thinking about this, but that point I think that he makes about I do not even know where it will stop is a very poignant one for us all, isn't it, around these issues, and then particularly in these contexts. So he also confirms his lack of knowledge regarding data rights, something we found to be widespread in the interviews that we undertook for people both in Nigeria and South Sudan. So in this talk, I want to suggest that non-knowledge is integral to processes of datafication in the humanitarian sector. This represents, my argument really is this represents an intensification of the coloniality of humanitarianism, or what Mirka Madianu calls a form of techno-colonialism associated with longer standing relations of colonial dependency. So scholars in the field of ignorance studies highlight the ways in which non-knowledge is regular, it's a universal aspect of social life and decision-making, right? Non-knowledge isn't unusual, to put it simply. And that can be oppressive, but it can also be emancipatory, right? It can function as a resource for the marginalised, scholars in that field argue, as well as a resource for the powerful. However, I want to suggest that the production of non-knowledge in the humanitarian context needs to be viewed through the lens of epistemic injustice, reflecting a form of violence, Gayatri Spivak shown to be bound up with colonial dynamics, whereby those occupying a subaltern positionality, in her terms, cannot know or speak. So this form of violence engenders what Miranda Fricker refers to as epistemic injustices, where people are devalued in their capacity as a knower or subject of knowledge due to their perceived lack of credence, either as a speaker or in terms of their lack of intelligibility in terms of the dominant episteme. So those are those ideas around testimonial injustice and hermeneutic injustice that Miranda Fricker speaks to. So the ways that people in situations of displacement are devalued, though not being addressed as subjects, through not being addressed as subjects with the capacity to know or say anything legible regarding datafication of the humanitarian sector, those ways that people are devalued come through in various ways through our interviews. So, for example, a woman living in a camp in South Sudan said to us that we don't ask about how our data is used because we don't know the system. They didn't explain it to us. So this statement's indicative of how there's a failure to inform and engage people in situations of displacement as subjects with epistemic capacity, and that this plays an active role in the formation or the production of non-knowledge. The point's also evident in a statement from this representative of an international NGO, who says that we need to be asking the people that are actually affected, and they should be the ones to determine what data, not just what data is collected, but they should actually be involved in that collection effort and have some way to actually own their data, have rights to see it, control it, know how it's been used, and we're pretty far from achieving that, I think. So in the humanitarian context, non-knowledge thus manifests in terms of what Christy Dotson calls a form of pernicious ignorance, where there's a failure of communicative reciprocity, and that this reflects a relationship of power, and it could be harmful due to the persistent processes of silencing that ensue. So this production of non-knowledge, I would say, deepens and extends what Didier Fassin talks about as a complex ontology of inequality, which involves a humanitarian form of moral reasoning that differentiates in a hierarchical manner the values of human lives. So what I want to do in the remainder of the talk, and tell me what time I need to stop talking.
45 minutes. We start at like 10 past.
Okay, so just before 5. Okay, I'll do my best. I might have to skim through some of the quotes, but what I want to take you to do is take you through the interview data, exploring how datafication intensifies the coloniality of humanitarianism. And I want to do that in terms of two related dynamics. First, the advance of extractive data practices, and particularly extractive data practices that presume ownership in ways that rely on epistemic and material forms of violence. And secondly, paternalistic dynamics based on a logic of care that assumes, on the one hand, a subject who lacks epistemic capacity, and the other, a subject that has that is kind of confident in their technological competence. So I'll guide you through a deep dive of this interview material, but both to show these aspects of the coloniality of humanitarianism, but also to highlight some of the frictions that arise in this context. And just to say that the interviews, if you're wondering who's speaking, SS or NIG refers to Nigeria, South Sudan, IO international organisations, and then it's just that we did our research in two phases, so it's just a phase and the number of the interviewee, if you're kind of keen to know that. So let's start now to look at the interviews carried out with humanitarian data experts. And several, I think it's interesting in these interviews because the coloniality arises quite explicitly in their discussions, and the extractiveness of contemporary data practices is explicitly raised. So this NGO representative says almost all humanitarian data is structured to benefit humanitarians. We probably claim, okay, our programming is then therefore benefiting affected people, and that's how we justify the focus. But at the end of the day, it's data for us and our purposes. It's an economy built around this data, politics and governance built around those data, yet affected people don't really see tangible results of it. So the issue of data ownership, its relationship to knowledge and power, is explicitly raised also by one of the donor representatives, who raises a question of how to decolonize data through the provision of access to humanitarian data. So they say, who holds the data? Who holds the power? Data is the power that we have, right? Knowledge is power. It's Foucault, basic colonialism. It's one of those areas that we need to look at. What does decolonizing data mean, right? You offer communities ways to access and understand data that you're generating, and that's a massive challenge. So I found it really interesting, you know, that as a donor representative talking about Foucault and decolonisation, it seemed a little bit kind of bizarre to me, but I found it also interesting. It's presented very much as humanitarians hold the key here, isn't it? You know, it's even if there's processes of opening up access and understanding of data, it's still something that humanitarians offer, even if they're finding that challenging, rather than something affected communities might take or reclaim, for example. So the epistemic closures on which extractive data practices rely are also more directly highlighted by some of the humanitarian experts with whom we spoke. For example, this INGO representative talks about supply-driven data. They say a lot of sort of tracking of people is how I often see humanitarian data or needs assessment data. They're very sort of supply-driven. And the same interviewee elaborates on this idea in terms of response-led data practices that produce data by and for humanitarians in support of a response that's already shaped by the end agency that's collecting the data. So they say, you know, when there's a needs assessment, the needs assessment has been devised by taking cluster services. So that's the kind of segregation of different aspects of humanitarian support, deciding what questions you would need to ask to determine which of those services to deploy, and then just like stacking up those questions on top of each other. The understanding of need that you get is very driven by the response that's probably already going to happen. So the material or financial drivers of these extractive processes were also identified by several of our interviewees, with donor demand and interagency competition described as key. This network representative says, I see competition within the sector driving data hugely. Everyone will have to be seen as having the best data. It's linked to visibility, who's leading, who's in the leading role, who's the lead on the ground. It's always been the case in the NGO world. It's also the case in the donor world that donors want to be seen as leaders. There are countries that want to be seen as leaders, and whoever gets data out first has the upper hand in terms of getting more funding and gaining a leading reputation. So I think we see very much the kind of internal dynamics here of humanitarianism and that kind of internal economies and interests. Another emphasises the pressure for donor accountability and this sort of a top-down requirement for accountability. So they say we collect the data because the owners, that is the donors, want accountability. They want accountability because of their constituents who are giving them money and allocating the money. Their constituents want their money to be used efficiently. So at the end of the day, we're serving their needs. We're doing needs assessments after needs assessments. Nobody's coordinating them. And it's just like incredibly extractive. That's not accountability. That's just box ticking at a certain point. So I don't know where the problem lies, but I think at a certain point, donors have to change the expectations about what data we collect and why. And just to give a bit of context for the extractiveness of this, when we were doing one workshop in Nigeria, one guy told me it was as many times as 5 times a day that he was being asked to share his information. So this isn't just like, you know, a few times a week even, you know, this is a kind of relentless experience for those people. Okay, so this theme of extraction comes out time and time again in our interviews with humanitarian data experts. Again here, so there's this sort of desire for endless data collection, endless extractive processes of how much we can learn about a humanitarian situation, where all that data goes, to what extent it gets used, sometimes is a bit hard to understand. And another says, well, there's lip service to the affected population, generating their own data, and sort of a couple of examples of that. Really, this is information that has been hoovered up from affected people and has been given to people outside of that affected community who are making decisions on their behalf. Okay, so I could add more and more quotes in about this, but I think, you know, what this analysis suggests is that this, you know, there is some reflectiveness, isn't there, about extractive practices in the humanitarian sector, data ownerships questions in ways that do point to both epistemic and material forms of violence, but these don't really in any meaningful way speak to decolonisation, whatever that might mean. So I kind of want to come back to this, but first look through the second theme, which is the theme of paternalism, which is another theme that comes up strongly in these interviews. So these paternalistic tendencies, these are explained by various of our interviewees. This is where relations of care and control combine. This is where, you know, the kind of freedom, responsibility of subjugated subjects, as Roth calls them, are exposed to harm. One network representative said that is it a task between a load of experts who are having to fight down about what kind of paternalistic value they're going to drop down. And another says that the way the data is being used now, still quite colonial, I'd say, in nature, very much of what can we learn about these people, how we therefore make decisions, the way we want to make about them, and how we're going to address their problems. So I think there's this idea humanitarians are operating under huge stress, and they're kind of doing the best that they can, and it's ultimately an altruistic pursuit. So again, this critique, internal critique of humanitarianism emerges. NGO representative talks about this in terms of the dispossession of agency. So data is used to dispossess the agency of different populations. I'm going to sit in my office with my directors and decide what these people need. Basically, I'm using the data, but I'm actually removing agency of the affected populations from developing. This is really dangerous. During COVID, we will have seen that more because you can't go face to face. That's a perfect occasion to stop talking to people, just sit in our offices and discuss between ourselves what these people actually need. And going further, this paternalism is questioned by a UN agency representative who talks about the ways in which there's this tendency to gloss over the protection risks for people who are in these countries when we're providing assistance. So they say that somehow, you know, because they're not doing online shopping the way we are, they don't have bank accounts with Citibank, they don't need as much protection of their identity or internet security. But I think he goes on to say, I think that's naive on our part, condescending and so paternalistic as well. And you know, we're collecting it for their good. We're so focused on collecting so much and at such a granular level, but is it really in people's best interest to have that information floating around? So on the one hand, of course, this statement kind of clearly rejects assumptions regarding the humanitarian field as divided, right, between those subjugated subjects who lack capacity or competence. On the other hand, subjects that Michael Barnett talks about as confident in their ability to make a positive difference. So there's a critique of this distinction within the field. But I think on the other hand, it also reaffirms this dynamic, doesn't it, in some respects, with this in reference to the best interests of affected communities. So really, again, the kind of critique and the decolonising agenda doesn't go so far, really, perhaps unsurprisingly, in the humanitarian sector. But I think we can go a bit further here as well to think about humanitarianism and in particular the ethics of do no harm in the humanitarian sector and the ways in which that perpetuates coloniality. even in the face of these appeals to decolonisation or to epistemic justice. And our interviews with humanitarian data experts, I think, highlight this quite clearly, because there's a lot of concerns there around accountability, the participation, the localisation agenda. Humanitarianism is very strong, that we need to kind of go to local communities and be, really much more engaged, responsive, and let local communities take a lead. So there's that strong sense there in the humanitarian sector, and also debates around data ethics and data rights that do touch on these issues of epistemic injustice, as I've already highlighted. The next quote is from a UN agency representative, and this, I think, highlights the sort of those debates around epistemic injustice as being quite prevalent there now. With they say, I think transparency and accountability to people should apply also to data discussions. Information's power. I think communities, to understand what's being said about them and their needs and their situation, should be an open thing. I think access is a big thing. I mean, access for people, like access to information, but also access to voice, information and opinions. So sense here of this need to go a bit deeper. But on the other hand, we also spoke to INGO representative, who described the barriers that arise, structural barriers that arise in the attempt to develop a more engaged dialogical approach to humanitarian data practices. And they say that the whole system is structured not to be listening. We'll go back to communities and we want to say, this is what we've found, this is how we've analysed it, this is what humanitarians have said, does it resonate with you? Are you able to use this for your own purposes based on what the data says? What are your recommendations? And they say, now we've added a final step, which is, how do we then turn that into more of a public good? How do we turn data into public good? So if there's a community that wants to use it for its own advocacy, how do we make sure that they've not just kind of this is what we did, this is what we took, here's what we did with it, but more, here's all the data, how do you want to use it? However, we get a lot of pushback because people, i.e. humanitarians, just feel like what we're telling them to do is really going against the whole aid machinery. So, I mean, I think we can still see limitations, can't we, in terms of this kind of these processes of humanitarian data, in terms of how they envisage it in a more radical form. But even so, that ability to put forward this participatory approach gets a lot of pushback. And I think what's notable here is that this pushback comes particularly in terms of this grounding in do no harm. So they say a lot of the pushback that we get is that people don't feel they can act on community feedback. If someone's never gotten anything, then we start asking them all these questions, then maybe they still don't get anything. We sort of don't want to do harm in that sense. So to put a bit of context to this, we were doing interviews in South Sudan. People were the conditions were horrific, and people were literally practically starving, and their food had been reduced. And they were having people go in, asking them lots of questions about data all the time. And obviously they were saying, yes, we need more food. But this wasn't being provided. So there's this kind of fundamental lack. And so this quote, I think, speaks to that sort of context where humanitarians are sort of saying, well, we can't ask too openly to affected communities what they want, what data we should collect, how it should be used, because we'll do harm. But I think there's something really perverse here, right? That listening is then precluded within the humanitarian sector on ethical grounds. It's framed as ethical not to listen to communities that humanitarians are extracting data from. So not listening here is ultimately the very foundation of a humanitarian ethics of do no harm, right? So in other words, epistemic injustice then becomes integral to the functioning of humanitarianism, and that only becomes more apparent, I think, as the so-called data revolution persists in this attempt to target aid in a kind of wider context of need. So to put it another way, data-driven humanitarianism precisely relies on what Michael Barnett calls the silencing of local voices. This is integral, with dynamics of extraction, paternalism and epistemic injustice perpetuating the coloniality of humanitarianism in the context of datafication. Of course, none of this will be very surprising, I think, for historians or critical scholars of humanitarianism. But I think what's important to note is that even as these debates regarding decolonisation become present within the sector, they are necessarily hugely limited. But also important is in these processes, I think, are the frictions that emerge. So disagreements, tensions surrounding humanitarian decision-making processes, regarding processes of data collection and data use. And I want to turn now in the final bit of the talk to talk about some of these frictions. So I don't know if there's anyone from data studies here today doing work in that area. No, because you've got a colleague called Jo Bates, I think, whose work I found really helpful here. So the concept of friction is introduced in the field of data studies. In particular, it was introduced to highlight the ways in which data sets don't travel easily, right? So there can be difficulties in translation, communicative difficulties, in sharing data sets, in kind of the scientific collaboration processes. So difficulties essentially in making data global and more widely usable. And that scholars in the field of data science have talked about the ways in which that creates frictions that are both computational and institutional, and that those frictions need to be mediated. But beyond those scientific and computational frictions, critical scholars have also pointed to the ways in which there are social frictions, social and political dimensions to frictional encounters with data. So Jo Bates highlights the ways in which friction can occur at the infrastructural or managerial level, but also in social cultural terms and in terms of regulatory frameworks. And Bates argues that data friction can be viewed as a productive opportunity in this sense, not only, a kind of friction in a negative sense, but a lack of friction, the smooth flow of data, she says, they say is not necessarily ethically preferable, since this can override deliberation about how to live in more equitable and just societies. So frictions over the production of use of humanitarian data in that sense are important because they influence, and I'm quoting Bates here, they influence what's made visible to and knowable by who, and therefore impact profoundly on the development of future knowledge and social relations. So by exploring the frictions that arise around humanitarian data, we can unpack blind spots, non-knowledge that's generated, and the ways that these are explicitly and implicitly challenged by people who are living in situations of displacement. So I'm going to just run through a few ways in which these frictions arise in our interviews in Nigeria and South Sudan. There's kind of two broad ways, really. One's in terms of the substantial provision of assistance and the ways in which provision is shared out. And then the second is in terms of the actual processes of data collection and use. And I'll run through these in turn quite quickly because we're running late on time now. 10 minutes, okay, perfect, thanks. So the first lot's around the sort of decision making and the assistance, humanitarian assistance, and these mainly come out in the Nigerian case, where, as you can see, we have people saying we're not treated equally. Tell anybody. They select small girls and give them, not old women like us. There's no equal treatment. A man says that there's no equal treatment. They only consider the vulnerability of the person and lactating mothers. Another, there's no equal treatment in any camp because of the nature and influx of IDPs. New arrivals to the camp are not enjoying some incentives like shelters and food. And food was not distributed equally because they're not distributing it according to tents. So there's different lines of disagreement here around the provision of assistance. Some saying it's not fair. For example, this elderly woman saying it's not fair because of who's excluded from that process. For others, it's not fair because it doesn't take account of the numbers that are present adequately. There's new arrivals that haven't been registered. There's new family members, and these all generate unfairness within the system of provision. So it's both the decision-making process regarding assistance and implementation of assistance itself that are challenged here, particularly by the people that we spoke to in Nigeria. But the second set of frictions, around data collection and data use were particularly prevalent around data collection in the South Sudanese context. So these quotes have sort of slightly different issues. I'll just share them both first. So the first one says, I've never spoken to any organisation since the time I was displaced in 2013. That's interesting, isn't it? We've got some people saying 5 times a day and some people saying never spoken. However, it may seem that the organisations would speak with women because they're the ones at home and we as men do not stay at home. I have to say that was not the case this was very specific, I think, to South Sudan. And then the second quote, some organisations can come and take information and do not return. Sometimes people can come and take the information and we do not know what they will do with the information. Sometimes we're afraid, like I can see you're a woman, you're taking this information, I don't know what you can do with this. That's my concern. So yeah, there's 2 slightly different issues here. One is around the potential for bias that's embedded in the system, with this guy in South Sudan saying, it's always done in the home and the men are not present. So there's, it's a skewed process. And then the second quote pointing actually to that kind of fear that arises. And it's worth noting that distrust, emerges in South Sudan, where there is particular distrust and concern around potential targeting by government authorities. And then there's a third set of frictions, again around data processes, but this time around data use. And these are evident in both Nigeria and South Sudan. So come out across the board, and I think bridge the first and second set of frictions in a way, in the sense that they question the provision of assistance or the lack thereof, based on a frustration of what they perceive to be a failure of humanitarian organisations to listen and to act on the information people have provided. So there's just 3 quotes to share here. The first, they used to collect people's account number, not any paper to sign, and they've collected many people's account number. There's no response. We do not hear anything. They're telling lies. Someone in South Sudan says they do ask, but it's not the way you're asking. They come to us at home, they ask about our needs. They interviewed me and I explained to them I need plastic sheeting, malaria, drugs and the needs of a household, but nothing happens. And then they will just collect data and go, our people here have participated in many interviews, but nothing has changed. So a strong sense of frustration. Just looking at this middle quote from the woman in South Sudan who says, they've interviewed me, I've explained to them what I need. She kind of, it became apparent through the interview that she'd asked for these things and she hadn't received hadn't received what she'd needed, as I said before, this lack of responsiveness. And when we asked whether she'd question those collecting her data about what would then happen with the information she provided, she said the following. She said, "I did not ask them because at that time we were speaking about the repair of the shelter. At that time it was hard to get the plastic sheeting and the sticks for repairing the tent. They eventually gave me the plastic sheeting, but did not give me the sticks. I'm here because there's nowhere to go. I would want to ask them, but I did not. They came to collect data like you are doing now, but they disappeared." So, as well as creating false hope, isn't it, in asking this woman what she required without being able to provide for basic needs, what these statements also suggest is that the very process of humanitarian data production closes down the space. It's actively closing down space for people to ask questions about why their data is being collected, what's going to happen with it, what decisions will be made, what actions will come of it, what are the limitations, of the capacity to respond to the needs being expressed. None of that's all closed down, right? So I'm going to wrap up, but I think, what comes really clearly through this research for me is the way that the datafication of the humanitarian sector, it has not facilitated the decolonisation of humanitarianism. Not that anyone suggested it would, but just to confirm, definitely hasn't. But I think, clearly intensifies that coloniality through the further advance of extractive and paternalistic data practices. This is something that's become clearly a concern within the sector itself. Debates over knowledge, power and colonialism are very much present and central to discussions around data-driven humanitarianism. But what I've argued is the very formation of humanitarianism as a field of operation renders the ethical injuncture of do no harm one that's intrinsically bound up with epistemic injustice. And that's not simply because the nature of humanitarian action can leave little space or time to listen to people on the ground. It's also because the very nature of humanitarianism is bound up with this hierarchical ordering of human life, assumptions regarding the distinction of subjects with the capacity to know, and those subjects with the capacity to know, but also those, of course, who don't have such capacities, whose decisions must be made about decisions, as we know, in this kind of context of what's seen as increased scarcity and an inability to respond. But questions persist, nevertheless, despite these processes silencing, isn't it? And that's really evident, I think. And I want to finish with this quote from the woman who I've just been, who I've just been talking about. And she extended to us, along with she specifically extended to us a request for feedback from our research findings, but also make this broader appeal to feedback. So she said, "What I want to ask is, we are here and we have no help. We are just staying, waiting for what we don't see, because life here is too hard for us. And if you're willing to do something or to share this with other people, you can help. There is no feedback from those who had interviewed us. I hope you will give us feedback." So demands of this sort by so-called affected communities, demands for fair treatment, for meaningful information and engagement, feedback on the outcomes of data practices, all point to the refusal of the epistemic injustices that are baked into the humanitarian sector. And listening in the midst of frictions might thus be understood, I think, as a starting point for understanding what's made visible to and knowable to whom, and for thinking together about the development of what Bates calls future knowledge and social relations. Thank you.
Just maybe stop sharing the screen.
Yeah, that's just, if anyone wants to use that to just go onto the website. But yeah, it's fine.
Do you want to come here?